I'm pleased to welcome Kyle Galler to BYU. He comes to us from University of Washington, where he's working right now in their European Union Studies Center. He's actually a permanent official at the Council of the European Union, and if you've taken a European Union class, you know that's where the member states negotiate, and it's kind of bigwig stuff. You know, I know when I visited Brussels, it was hard to get into that building. It takes some intelligence. Anyway, Kyle Galler has been a permanent official at the General Secretariat of the Council of the EU since 1999. He's been working in the Directorate-general, which is it's like the European way to say the ministry or department, with responsibility for economic and financial affairs since 2001. He was previously in the department responsible for the internal market, or the single market. His background includes positions with Her Majesty's Treasury in the UK and an early start with Price Waterhouse in London. He's a regular lecturer to the UK Civil Service, their college courses on the European Union, both on the role of the Council and in specific areas of economic policy. He was educated at Emmanuel College at Cambridge University. He received a BA in Classics with double first-class honors, and he's also fluent in French. He has a wife, and he's the parent of 2 children, and right now he lives in Seattle, Washington State.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I think you missed off my javelin throwing skills at Cambridge University and my 165 bowling average for the 1985-86 season. I'm slightly overwhelmed. Thank you all for coming. I hope I'm going to entertain you at least to the point that you're not asleep for the next half an hour, and then I'll look forward to taking questions from you. It was said that the Council of Ministers is difficult to get into. I'm not sure about that. It's very difficult to find your way around the building once you're in there. So dealing with the bigwigs to a large extent involves tracking down ministers who've got lost. But I have spent a large part of the last 10 years of my life working with finance ministers and economic ministers of the member states. So I'm at least minimally qualified to talk on this topic today. This year, the European Union will be celebrating 50 years of the Treaty of Rome and the formation of the European Economic Community. People actually get very bored of me telling them that the European Economic Community wasn't the first community after the Second World War. We actually started with the coal and steel community in 1952, and they get bored because they know what's coming next, which is that the motivation for all of European integration was to avoid having another world war. It's very difficult for my generation and your generation to imagine what it must have been like to live on a continent through 50 years of pretty much total war and economic deprivation in between those wars. The idea behind the coal and steel community was that if you pool the resources you need to build the equipment for war, you can't go to war. That's not the idea behind the European Economic Community. However, that's a development of the same sort of path. People forget about the European Defence Community. That's because it never truly came into existence. It was vetoed in 1954 by the French government, and that was the idea behind that was to actually pool the armies of the participants to that community, particularly France and Germany. When that didn't work, because it was a step too far to have a joint army in order to avoid going to war, it was felt that if we could find some common economic policy objectives, then we could build on the cooperation we'd established with the coal and steel community, and instead of just avoiding war, we could add on top of that doing something a bit more positive. Now, when people say to me, you guys in Europe, you have thousands of people in your meeting rooms debating every dot and comma of all your legislation, that must cost a fortune. How wasteful is that? I always think, yes, to a certain extent it is wasteful. My personal record is in a meeting room with 60 people in, spending 15 minutes debating whether or not to put a comma in a particular sentence. I don't actually remember whether we put that comma in or not. But I also think at those times, when it's slightly frustrating, there was a serious possibility that Europe could have gone to war again after the Second World War if we hadn't got the solutions right then. So at moments of low productivity, let's say, in Europe, it's always worthwhile thinking of what the alternative could be. And if you're talking about economic development, the one thing that really doesn't help economic development is war. So, however bad things get in Europe, and I'm not saying they do get that bad, they're always much, much better than they could have been without economic integration. Now, the EU as a system, in order to avoid us going to war again, has developed a very cunning system whereby we identify the common objectives we have. We've already pooled our resources so that we can't go to war. We've got no coal and steel of our own. Then what we do is we build on that by identifying common objectives that we'd like to pursue together. And then instead of going directly after the detail of those common objectives, what we do is create permanent institutions in order to pursue those objectives. Once we've agreed on the objectives, and once we've agreed and set up our institutions within which we discuss those objectives, we can start negotiating. And the best way to avoid a big argument is to have a large series of small arguments. And that's what we do in Europe. We agree on the overall objectives, and then we negotiate the details as to how we're going to achieve those objectives. And working in the Council, with 27 member states around the table, advising presidencies on how they get a compromise, basically, it's fairly straightforward. You need to make sure everybody has got a good news story to go home with, however small. That's how you get everyone to sign up to the big things, where it's not always in your interest in every single element of the detail, but the overall objective is one that you support, and on certain of your smaller interests, you have won the discussion. We're not always one big happy family, so in the end you have to establish your dispute resolution mechanism. Our old dispute resolution mechanism was war, and we didn't think that was a very good one. So we have a European Court of Justice, which arbitrates on and decides on any legal disputes that we have. And all of the courts in Europe are subject to the authority of the European Court of Justice. It's like our Supreme Court. So, that's how you go about establishing your mechanisms for keeping a permanent discussion going. And that's what Europe's about. It's a permanent, ongoing argument. But to the outside world, it looks like a permanent, ongoing discussion. What we did in Europe, first of all, was to create a customs union with a single external tariff. So instead of having now 27 member states all imposing different customs tariff regimes, we have one. So already, right back in the beginning, back in the 60s, when we got our customs union sorted out, it looks to the outside world as if we are one entity, slightly more than it looks to us from the inside, as though we're one entity. So after we got the customs union, external face, it's just one of us, you're dealing with Europe. We then need to make it look on the inside as though you're dealing with Europe. So that was the Single Market Programme, launched in the middle of the 80s with a deadline of 1992 for the free movement of goods, services, capital and labour. Some people like to think of labour as people, but some people prefer to think of it just as labour, but that's what we're aiming at when we talk about free movement of labour. We've also managed to develop a single external face on multilateral trade negotiations. To add to that, Europe negotiates as a bloc, and it's in the individual countries' interest to pool their resources, argue about the details in private, and then have one big public face negotiating as a big entity in the WTO, for instance. To add to that, to help both with our single market and with our representation to the outside world, we have a single currency. That's a readily identifiable image of Europe. It's the people who run the euro, and it's the people who negotiate on trade. That places Europe firmly as an entity on the global stage. Now, when I was looking into doing this talk, I'm not personally a trade expert, but I spoke to some friends who know a bit more about it, who said, tell the Americans that the EU is the world's largest economy, with a GDP of $13.4 trillion a year to the US's 12.4. They said you could also add that there are 480 million people in Europe versus 300 million in the US. And they can go away and do the math themselves and see how good they feel. But they can come back with a positive message that the EU and the US work together a lot. There is a huge trading relationship. And if you put us together, we've got 10% of the global population, either American or European. We account for 40% of all the trade in the world, and we account for 60% of the world's GDP. Now, take a second to think about that. That is immense. That is a stunning position of world leadership, and it's something that brings with it certain responsibilities. Now, as many people have pointed out to me, that figure of 60% of global GDP isn't going to remain up at 60% for very long if we carry on like we are carrying on. Emerging countries, particularly in Asia, particularly China and India at the moment, seem to be catching us up very, very rapidly. The EU got wind of this quite a while ago, just after we'd introduced our single currency. There's a thematic progress here from customs union. As soon as that's out of the way, we move on. Next big thing is the single market. As soon as we've completed that, we get the single currency in. And as soon as we get the single currency in, we realize we really need to get our economy into shape for the 21st century. So in 2000, we got together and we set ourselves a strategic objective in Europe to become the world's most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy. Sounds pretty good. We also wanted that knowledge-based economy to produce sustainable jobs, more and better jobs, and greater social cohesion with environmental sustainability. It's a pretty long list, and it's a pretty big ask. But what's key in there is that we recognize that in the global economy, knowledge is going to be the key. We are not going to win the competition in global markets on the price of our labour, cost of our labour. We're not going to compete on that. What we need to do is to play to our strengths, play to knowledge, innovation, and producing premium products and premium services. Halfway through that, in 2005, our 10-year period, the drive to glory, we had a look at how far we'd got. I think it's reasonably fair to say that we were slightly disappointed with the progress that we'd made, and we decided that what we really needed to do was focus on growth and jobs. That's what the EU needs, growth and jobs. And in order to get those growth and jobs, what we really needed to do was make sure that our labour markets were functioning properly and that we were supporting innovation. And that 2005 review, for the first time, we placed this strategy, which previously had been viewed as something pretty much internal to improve the performance of the EU economy in a vacuum, into a specific context of accelerating globalization. That means there are more competitors out there, more directly affecting us in our daily lives. It also means there are more opportunities out there. It also means that there are more regimes around the world, regulatory regimes, within which, if you're going to have a level playing field on economic terms, you need international cooperation. We're not alone. If we're going to benefit from globalization, and a lot of the talks I give on this subject, people don't really seem to have heard the phrase benefit from globalization. There's a great fear of globalization out there, in Europe in particular. What we need to do, this is our strategy. We're going to be competitive and innovative at home. We're going to make our labour markets more flexible so that we can adjust to the dynamics of the global marketplace. Where that means that certain sectors are no longer profitable for European enterprises, people will have to retrain into other sectors. Given that there's a history of high levels of social protection in Europe, people are worried about losing their jobs and therefore resist flexibility of labour markets. The model that we're looking to pursue now is called flex security. It's developed largely in the Nordic countries, particularly in Denmark, whereby you don't prop up sectors that are failing. You don't protect people's employment for a very, very long term. What you do is explain to them that, yes, owing to global competition, they might lose their jobs. But if and when they do, they will be supported in the short term and helped to retrain to go into another productive sector, and normally a more productive sector, because you just can't afford to subsidize certain sectors forever. In order to do all of this, and in order to give our businesses confidence to invest, we also need to place our public finances on a sound footing. Basically, Europeans are getting older. On average, they're getting a lot older. They're living longer, and there aren't so many young people coming through. Our birth rates are low. What this means, basically, is that when people retire, they can expect to draw pensions for a longer period. And in the European tradition, where we pay pensions out of current taxation, and we pay healthcare costs out of current taxation, if you have fewer people in the workplace supporting more people in retirement for longer, that creates a huge hole in your finances. So you've either got to get some more money in from somewhere, let's boost economic growth, or you've got to reform your pension systems, make people work a bit longer, give them smaller pensions, make them provide for their own retirement rather than expecting the state to pay their pensions out of taxation. We also need to reform our healthcare systems, because the costs of long-term healthcare for the elderly are absolutely vast. This is something that is a key and urgent issue to be tackled in Europe, because our populations are aging quite rapidly in certain member states. So we got to 2005 and we weren't so impressed with our progress. We were doing okay, but we weren't making too much headway towards becoming the world's most dynamic and competitive economy. But what we have found is that we are making some progress now. People have taken on board the message and they've introduced some reforms after the 2005 prescription. Growth in the EU was up to 2.9% last year. That's not hugely spectacular on a global level, but it's much better than we've seen in Europe for a very long time. Our member states are also making real progress on getting their budget deficits down and planning for the long term, ensuring sustainability by reducing the national debt and putting away some money to pay for future pensions and healthcare. And finally, actually making those reforms to pensions and healthcare that mean that the systems are sustainable. We're also seeing, finally, the benefits coming through of reforms to research and development and unleashing the potential of our small and medium-sized enterprises. It's a long haul. Initially, we thought it was going to be 10 years. The deadline, the goal is still there, but it's an ongoing process. It won't end in 2010. We've got to keep on with this. The European Commission has outlined what it thinks should be the priorities in this strategy for the year ahead. Given that we're now making progress on research and development and on the public finances, they are the baseline from which we can start. Now they're sorted out to a certain extent. The priorities for the year ahead should be regulation, reducing the burden on business so that our small businesses can build themselves up and can flourish, start creating jobs and start creating wealth. People sometimes criticize the EU for having lots and lots of regulation. I think it's about 80,000 pages of European law. I acknowledge that that's quite a lot of law. And I acknowledge that in certain areas, and the EU as a whole acknowledges this, some of that needs to be streamlined a bit. But again, you need to remember that this is, if there's a European legislation, Normally that replaces what would be 27 different sets of national legislation. And it enables you to do business with those 27 countries according to one set of rules instead of 27. Second priority area is going to be energy. Energy is political, energy is economic. When you live next door to Russia and you live in an economy where the geopolitical situation, as they call it, is sometimes a bit tense, and when you use an awful lot of energy, you need to be careful about what you're doing on energy. And the EU has so far never had a coordinated energy policy for the EU as a whole. So that's the priority for the year ahead, to develop that coordinated energy policy. Tying in with all of that, climate change. Now's the time. If we don't do it now, the results could make 2.9% economic growth, and the worries about the difference between 1% and 2% and 3% economic growth look entirely ridiculous within a few decades. So climate change is top of the priority list as well for the EU. And our external strategy builds on this internal strategy. We're looking to produce quality goods and services at competitive prices. We need to get into global markets. We need to see globalization as an opportunity. We need to make sure that our comparative advantages are used to the full. So this has been defined in terms of penetration of capital, technology and premium products into expanding markets. But very crucially, this depends on the appropriate legal protection. This means intellectual property rights. And this is a huge area in which the US and the EU share concerns, share interests, and share responsibility for leading the dialogue around the world to ensure that intellectual property rights are respected. If we don't get this right, then we're going to lose an awful lot of the value from our key areas of skill, which are innovation and development. If we want to sell our premium services around the world, we need to acknowledge that we're going to have to be open to others' exports, to their areas of comparative advantage. That's the basis of international trade. If we behave in a protectionist fashion, we can't expect others around the world to open up their markets to our products. And we need to do a bit of PR. Everyone's scared of globalization. It ought to be good news. The EU is a history of increasing international trade. We used to be 27 different countries. Now we are a single internal market. You can export that kind of treatment to the global level. And with globalization, it's more or less going to come in like that, whether you like it or not, because protectionism is not in the long term sustainable. So what we need to do is recognize that greater international trade should be to the benefit of everyone. It's always been to our benefit, and we ought to be able to embrace it and work within our comparative advantage. And how are we going to ensure that our comparative advantage is served? Intellectual property rights, making sure people respect our innovations and enable us to benefit from those innovations. Public procurement. That's another area where we think we have expertise that if other markets around the world would open up public procurement to international competition, the EU could make a great deal of headway. And thirdly, competition rules. Now, the EU and the US have had some spectacular fallings out on competition enforcement. I'm based in Seattle at the moment, and I never cease to hear about the spectacular fallings out. But my trade people, again, said that trade disputes only affect, I think, 2% of trade across the Atlantic. And on competition, there are so many more issues on which the EU and the US agree than on which they disagree, that it's extremely disappointing to see the infrequent fallings out, given so much press and airtime. Again, the EU and the US have clearly overlapping interests on competition rules, and we should be serving as global leaders to make sure that competition regimes around the world respect the level playing field so that producers can compete in a fair way. Now, in order to get what we're after, in order to increase international trade, in order to increase our access to world markets while enabling others to access ours, we like to pursue both bilateral and multilateral processes. And the big multilateral process in WTO, the Doha round, we believe is not yet dead. So, to sum up that, we think there's a two-way process for openness at home that needs to be matched by openness in overseas markets. We believe it's also clear that tariff barriers are becoming less and less important in terms of the role they play in obstructing fair global trade. What are actually more important are non-tariff barriers. And these are being thrown up around the world, and what we need, it's the European model, maintain the dialogue to resolve the problems. Again, we've got our priority issues there, intellectual property rights. These are the areas where we think the EU is going to make its way in the international economy. Intellectual property rights for our innovative products. Services. Both the EU and the US are pretty much service-driven economies. We are not going to make a great deal of headway in selling standard goods around the world because we can't compete on price. What we can do is sell top-end, high added value services. Investment. Developing economies need a lot of investment, and they need a lot of investment expertise. And that's something we're very, very good at. And then public procurement and competition, as I've already mentioned. Now, I said the Doha round we think is still alive. We not only think it's still alive, we think it's extremely important that it be successful. And speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, our Trade Commissioner, Peter Mandelson, said this. And for the podcast audience, I'll read that out. There are hundreds of billions of dollars of new trade riding on this round. But an equally important consideration is the consequence of failure. The world will lose its insurance policy against the spread of protectionism. We will see a loss of confidence in the WTO system, and we will preside over a major setback for multilateralism. Now, if we get back to where I started on how the EU works and how important it is to keep multilateral dialogue open, because the costs of failure are so huge, you can see why the EU feels very, very strongly that if we preside over this loss of confidence and a setback for multilateralism, it's almost inevitable that we'll slip back into protectionism. And in the medium to long term, protectionism doesn't help anyone. The history of the EU is 50 years of economic integration, 50 years of multilateralism and of opening up markets to competition. For us, first and foremost, it's delivered peace, stability and security. Without that, we realized very, very painfully over the first half of the 20th century, you can't do anything. You build on that by developing economic prosperity. So we have a very, very strong instinct towards multilateralism. I mentioned the euro earlier. As it's my special topic of interest, I'll only have this one slide on it, and that'll be the end of my part. I'm more than happy to answer questions, but I have to recognize myself that once I get going on the euro, I can go for hours, and people aren't necessarily as interested as I am. We in Europe have a single market that's 480 million people. We think that's quite an impressive achievement. We've also managed to develop a single currency that covers 300 million of them. Excuse me for also thinking that that's quite impressive. The enormity of the challenge of bringing together, ensuring the convergence of what are now 13 countries' economies to such an extent that they could change over their currencies to have a single currency with a single short-term interest rate. That achievement is enormous. It's brought us a lot of economic benefits, and we think it's placed us more centrally on the global stage as the European Union. It's a source of great satisfaction for us that Slovenia joined the euro as the 13th country on the 1st of January this year. and you look at that 300 out of 480 million people, that's only going to rise because we expect all the new member states who have joined the European Union over the last few years, and we hope that other member states who've been in the European Union for somewhat longer will eventually join the single currency. And then you'll have a real presence on the global stage that matches the single currency with the single market that we have. Thanks very much, and I'm open to your questions.
Ask your question, make sure you get the mic.
You mentioned the...
Sounds good.
Okay. You mentioned the dough around. I just was wondering what the European Union is willing to do to make sure that the dough around doesn't fail so that you can prevent these consequences that you discussed, mainly in the area of the agricultural subsidies.
I knew the agricultural subsidies would come up. It's not my particular area of expertise, but I am told, and Commissioner Mandelson has repeated this at Davos again, that the EU feels it's made an offer on agriculture. And the EU feels that the developing nations think that that's an offer that could be an acceptable offer if the US were willing to match it in kind. So to a certain extent, the ball's in your court. Don't ask me. We've done our bit and we're waiting to see if you guys can respond in like fashion. I've, had a lot of questions in my time in Seattle and on tour on the West Coast, where people have some very strong interests in agriculture. And I understand the political difficulties, but it's very clear that getting the Doha round back on track and sorted out, it's a bit too late to get it back on the track we thought it should have been on, but getting it sorted out to avoid the calamitous failure about which Commissioner Mandelson spoke is very much going to depend on getting an agreement on agriculture. And the EU feels that it's already gone some way. And the deal that the EU has suggested is one that it was very, very difficult for the EU to come to an agreement to be able to offer that deal. And therefore, the ball is very much in the American court to wait and see if you can come up with something that can move things along a bit. But we would very much like to see something coming out of this because, as I've said, the consequences of failure are very, very negative. You go for it. You're in charge.
Hi. Yes, you mentioned some of the comparative advantages that the EU has, and specifically focusing on high-end services and stuff like that.
Yep.
I was just wondering if you could give some examples of some of those services and products in which the EU has a comparative advantage in.
Oh, that's very, very mean. We like to think that it depends between different countries, and comparative advantage is always such that you don't necessarily need to be a global leader to have a comparative advantage in a particular area. We feel that lots of the public procurement areas that we'd like to see opened up, particularly development of IT systems for government, particularly large construction projects, these are the sorts of things that the EU can do very well. Financial services, we have a great deal of expertise in the European Union, which contrasts starkly with the areas where we clearly no longer have comparative advantage.
Explain what IT is. Some people don't know.
IT, information technology. So setting up all the systems that governments in developing nations would wish to buy to modernize their administrations, we think there's a marketplace for us out there. We also think we have some very, very strong design expertise where certain developing economies don't focus so much on design at the top end. But the opposite example is that Portugal is struggling quite badly now because its textile sector is struggling to compete with China. And if we continue to attempt to compete in sectors where price is the determining factor, because there's not a great deal of skill that goes into production, then we are destined to lose. So what we need to do is to focus on that knowledge end of things, make sure that our research stays ahead of the game, and make sure that we have access to markets and protection for our products so that we can continue to, trade profitably. And other areas like pharmaceuticals and telecommunications, we think we're very strong in certain areas there. Those are the sorts of things where we believe high added value from high additional knowledge or additional innovative skill would enable the EU to work its comparative advantage to the full.
You said that the member states have been making progress on public finances, and I was just wondering what kind of progress is being made and what exactly you mean by those public finances.
Okay, there are two areas that we really want to focus on in the EU on public finances. The first is, in the short term, getting budget deficits under control. And we have something called the Stability and Growth Pact that says you should have an annual budget deficit of less than 3%. And a large number of our member states have, throughout the prolonged slowdown that we've experienced since 2001, they've had real trouble in getting their deficits below 3%. The vast majority of them should be getting their deficits, according to current projections, below 3% this year. And that's the first time in a long time for a lot of them. So that's a positive development. The second and more important area is to get long-term sustainability for the public finances. And that's where getting your deficit under control and getting your accumulated debt under control links in with making the appropriate provisions for the aging populations to make sure that your pension systems are sustainable. And to a large extent that means moving from pay-as-you-go systems to ex-ante funded systems. It also means reforming your healthcare systems so that they are sustainable, either through better funding or through adjusting service levels to make sure that you are not walking into long-term liabilities with aging populations. We believe that if you don't have those basics right, then it's very, very difficult for businesses to have the confidence in the economy as a whole to invest. And over the medium term, it becomes difficult for the European Central Bank to manage the single currency that is shared by 13 different countries with 13 different economic policies, 13 different budget deficits, 13 different accumulated debt piles, and 13 different profiles of future public expenditure. Once everything is tidied up so that we can have confidence in its sustainability, then people will have confidence to invest, and consumers will also go out and have confidence to spend to make sure that we get the economic growth that we think we're capable of.
All right. You spoke about flex security.
Flex security.
And I think that's an incredible idea, and I hope to see something soon like that in the U.S. My question is what in the areas in the countries where flex security or that type of program has been installed, what do the people that are being moved from one sector to another, what does the populace think? What does society think of moving from one area to another? Do they agree with it, or are some people stuck in their jobs and like what they do, or etc.?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The reason that this has become an area that is the hot topic for discussion is that because there's a tradition of social protection in Europe that means that certain people have very, very long-term job contracts. And even when the sector that they're in ceases to be competitive in the global economy, it's very difficult to encourage them to try and go and find another more profitable job. So you have unproductive labour staying in jobs where it's not really making anything good for the economy. In the countries that have introduced flexicurity, what there's shorter term job contracts so that it's easier to hire and fire people. It's very easy to see that people in jobs think that means it's easy to get fired. But what the counterpart to that is that companies are more willing to take on people because they know that if they get into economic problems or if the cycle goes against them, the business cycle, they have the flexibility to lay people off so that they can remain in business. What then happens with flexicurity is that when you do lose a job, you have high levels of social security payments and full support for retraining so that you can go to a more productive sector. And the experience to date is that people seem to be very happy with this because the vast majority of them do retrain and do find other jobs. And it's looking at it as an opportunity versus a threat. If you're working in an unproductive sector, how fulfilling is that going to be, living on state subsidies for your sector and knowing that there's no real future for that business, versus retraining and getting yourself into a productive sector in which you can make yourself a profitable, productive and fulfilling career. And you're all here as students. You could have gone out to work at 18. You're here and you are studying to train yourselves up for careers which you will find more fulfilling than just taking the job that's offered to you at the first point that you enter the job market and staying in that for life. That's the idea behind it. We're living in a developing economy where people have to develop their skills and move to the jobs that best suit them. And I think the experience to date is that people are finding that this does help them to end up in the place where they feel they ought to be.
All right, you may have covered this just a little bit, talking about stable public funds and everything like that. But what I'm wondering is, as the market becomes more competitive based and the disparity of wealth between countries is lessened, I'm wondering if the disparity of wealth within countries is growing greater, and if so, what can be done to combat that, about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer?
Okay, that's a good question. The general answer is we're perfectly happy with the rich getting richer so long as the poor don't get poorer. In absolute terms, if there's greater disparity, that's something that certain member state governments would wish to tackle. I put my hand up now. I'm British. The British tradition is that greater wealth disparity isn't necessarily a problem if the absolute level of wealth of the lower sectors of society is not reduced. That increases overall wealth. Some member states in the European Union stick more strongly to a tradition of managing disparity in wealth and in income so that it doesn't become what they would regard as a social problem. That is to a large extent national policy rather than European Union policy. The thing we have with the euro is that we have a single monetary policy, but all the rest of economic policies in the member states is still pretty much at the member state level. The Lisbon strategy that I was talking about is a strategy whereby everyone comes to the table with their economic priorities, lays out their economic programs, we discuss it and we develop best practice, and we develop an overall prescription. But within that broad prescription, it's up to individual member states. So within that, the disparity question is a question for member states, but everyone is focused on increasing economic growth and overall prosperity within society, which historically seems to include a certain element of the rich getting richer, and if you manage it correctly, needn't include any element of the poor getting poorer, and should include the poor also getting richer. But within that, you've got possibilities for increasing disparities, and there's a range of responses from governments on that.
With flexicurity, I had a question about that. Is there a tendency with flexicurity to, as far as jobs that have higher job security and lower firing rates traditionally, in countries where flexicurity exists, is there a tendency for there to be a higher firing rate in these kinds of sectors as well? Just say something that has a really low firing rate. In countries where there's flexicurity, is there a higher firing rate in these same sectors? Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense, but I'm going to disappoint you because I don't really know. Where flexicurity has been taken forward the most is in the Nordic countries, which aren't the countries that traditionally have the protected job scenario. But what they are laying out is a model whereby if you do fire people, you retrain them. And you give them the confidence to go into an industry where they might be fired because they know that they'll get social welfare payments and retraining if they are fired. With that as an inspiration, certain other member states are looking at reforming their labour contracts so that you can introduce more flexible hiring and firing and make it palatable to the people who previously felt they wanted a job for life or nothing by, offering the prospect of a series of jobs with training and support between the jobs if you can't stay in one job for life.